And thank you everyone for being here to this webinar on how can the world, the global community support LMIC fossil fuel producers achieve sustainable development goals in a low carbon future. My name is Yacob Mulugetta. I'm professor of energy and development policy at the University College London, and also leading the partnerships of the climate compatible growth program. So welcome everyone. Well, we have some wonderful speakers with us today. We've got Philip Trotter, who will be doing the initial presentation about the whole question relating to fossil fuel phase down in relation to developing countries or LMIC countries, and we'll have reactions from some exceptionally good people who we have the pleasure of having with us. So we have Jean-Paul Adam, who is the Director for Policy Monitoring Advocacy in the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa and the United Nations Secretary to the United Nations Secretary General. Jean-Paul has a huge experience in this field, also having led the Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resources Management Program at UNECA, UN Economic Commission for Africa, but also served as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Health for Seychelles. So privileged to have you, Jean-Paul. Another second person is Navroz Dubash, who is professor at the Center for Policy Research, where he conducts research and writes on climate change, energy, air pollution, politics of regulation, and so forth. And Navroz has been actively engaged in the climate debate as a scholar, policy advisor, but also as an activist for over 25 years. He was instrumental in establishing the Global Climate Action Network in 1990. Welcome, Navroz. Mohamed Sokona is Senior Investment Officer in the Non-Sovereign Infrastructure Finance Division at the African Development Bank. Mohamed is a national of Mali with over 12 years experience in the area of structuring sustainable energy and infrastructure projects. Prior to joining the AFDB, Mohamed was a technical advisor at the ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, ICRI, where he was seconded by GIZ. Pleasure to have you, Mohamed. And then finally, last but not least, for sure, is Tasneem Essop, Executive Director of Climate Action Network International, CAN, a leading expert on climate, energy, poverty, and social justice issues, having served on the National Planning Commission of South Africa and held senior government positions in South Africa, including as Provincial Minister for Environment, Planning, and Economic Development. Thank you for all of you for being here, but I will just say make a couple of points before we hand over to Philip. I mean, the first is that the international community has made its commitment in the Paris Agreement to keep global heating well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees. This goal will not be achieved without substantial reduction in the rate of fossil fuel production and use. And this decline would need to be rapid and would cause, of course, major challenges to the fossil fuel industry itself, but also in terms of loss and government revenues. And at the same time, this transformation would have to be structural and very deep. This gives rise to a number of questions, such as the decline. How do you manage this decline in a just manner, which respects the needs of countries, companies, particularly communities that are impacted by such a transition? And of course, when we talk about the low and middle income countries that are fossil fuel producers, they lack many of the prerequisites for delivering such transitions, including access to finance, physical infrastructure, adequate governance, and so forth. So I think this debate or this discussion that we will have will try to make some sense as we head towards the COP in a couple of weeks. So just a few housekeeping notes. We will be, well, I should have announced this, but we are recording this event, and I hope it's okay with everyone. I would also ask every participant to mute, and timekeeping with panels as well, which I will enforce with a velvet stick, should I say. So without a further ado, Philip, let me invite you to keynote speak.
Thank you very much, Yacob, for your introduction. I hope you're able to see the screen. Is that the case? Quick nod. Yes, that's the case. Okay, great. So just to set up this discussion, where we're coming from is we, as a group of researchers from, I think, around 15 research institutions, and we're 25 of us in total, looked at this issue of what happens to fossil fuel producing low and middle income countries in this transition. And the paper is currently under review at Nature Energy, and we will publish a working paper on it, so that we can also support our efforts at COP, where this paper will be discussed. And what the paper does is really frame this issue in terms of, let me see. There we go. In terms of two different pressures. I think Yacob has already mentioned the climate pressure that is quite clear for fossil fuel production and use. It is obvious that we cannot meet the Paris Agreement without a substantive and rapid decline of fossil fuel production. There are recent estimates that suggest that oil and gas production has to decline by 3% each year until 2050, and coal has to decline even steeper to meet the Paris goals. What is interesting, though, is that there's, on top of the climate pressure, there's a lot of economic pressure that is also being exerted on fossil fuel production. The International Energy Agency is assuming that all fossil fuel demand will start to decline before 2030, so that we will have a peak that is in this decade. We're already seeing this peak kind of past the peak in, for instance, OECD Europe, where temperature-adjusted reductions have occurred in the order of 20% in a time frame of 1.5 years. Just recently, in the first 2 quarters of 2023, 68 gas power projects globally have been put on hold or cancelled, most of them because of economic. It made no sense economically anymore, and there are other options with renewables and batteries that are just cheaper. And then at the same time, the fossil fuel costs also increase as CO2 prices globally are rising substantially. It's likely that this will lead to further asset stranding, and the cost of capital, which already is really high for fossil fuels, will be very high for low and lower middle income countries. So for countries in this lower middle income and low income segment, these trends, these pressures have severe implications for their development opportunities, because current development plans are often very closely intertwined with fossil fuel revenues, as Yacob has alluded. So what we are trying to do in this paper, and what I'm trying to go through here very quickly, are 3 key issues that arise in this context. The first one is that there are, while kind of the UNFCCC process often, and the literature also often groups these low and middle income countries together as, the G77 plus China, for instance, and other groups, there are huge country-specific differences in the fossil fuel dependence of these countries, and so we want to untangle those a little bit, because then second, the types of development transitions that would have to occur in a situation like the one we're currently in are very much then dependent on the types of fossil fuel dependence, and they're very context and country-specific, and we'll try to come up with a framework here. and then also the required support mechanisms that the international community, but also countries themselves, have to engage in are not well specified currently, and this is also something that the paper then tries to do. So let me just go through these 3 points in this keynote very quickly. The first one is that the fossil fuel dependencies are very different for different low and middle income country producers. So what this chart does, it looks at the amount of production of fossil fuel that we have, and it looks at the amount of fossil fuels that are being used domestically or used for export. And so you have a bunch of countries that currently are not yet producing fossil fuels, or just at a very low level, but have quite substantial plans to do so, either to use it domestically, or in the case of Senegal, Uganda, Mozambique, are cases where they're planning to use fossil fuels for export going forward, whereas other countries are more using it for import. And then you have a range of existing producers of fossil fuels. Some of them, like India, are mainly using it for domestic purposes, while some other countries like Chad, Angola, Congo are mainly using it for export. And so this, while the boundaries kind of course, are shifting, and there's no clear-cut archetypes, there are certain types of transitions, we argue, that are more salient in some of these countries than they are in others. So what we are doing now is taking this exact same chart and thinking for which of these types of countries, which types of transitions are specifically salient. And if you look at it, you can then think about kind of 4 quadrants, just conceptually, schematically. The first one is these emerging producers where you don't have a lot of fossil fuel usage yet in production. Well, usage maybe yes, but not a lot of production yet, and it's mainly used for domestic issues. Here, you would have to engage in an energy transition. So you wouldn't kind of focus on the fossil fuels, but try to diversify your energy system. In cases where, and this is of course the case for all of these countries, so this energy transition has to kind of be happening away from fossil fuels, has to happen in all kinds of, in all different countries. But then you have 2 further issues. The first one is the economic transition. So if you're using fossil fuels primarily for domestic export, your economic dependency is not as high as if you're using it primarily for exports, where a lot of your economic revenues are actually depending on fossil fuels. And there are some countries that are planning to do this in the future, like Mozambique, for instance, and there are some countries that are already doing this, like Angola. And in those cases, you have this added challenge that in addition to an energy transition that has to happen domestically, you also have to think about a more structural economic transition that also has to occur. And to diversify away from these revenues. The third one is this issue of equitable fossil fuel production transitions. This is, of course, equitable and just transitions are important in all contexts. Here specifically, we're talking about those that have already quite a substantial existing infrastructure with workers being employed in these sectors and regions depending on this. And so there you have to, in this transition, you really have to think about how can you do this in a just and equitable way. So depending on which countries you have different types of setups that you have here. And in the paper, we're looking at sort of different country cases like Laos, Mozambique, Angola, and India. India will hear a little bit from potentially from Navroz on the call, and countries like Angola, of course, that are very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. They have to kind of they face the most complex set of transitions that we can think about. The next thing that we then did once we had this established, we then looked at the readiness of different countries, how they kind of currently how it stacks up with these different energy and equitable and economic transitions. and just looked at a bunch of indicators to understand, and you see quite different patterns emerging. So something like the energy transition in Angola, if you look at the Angolan case, darker blue means better, if you want. So on a couple of things, like the solar PV potential, levelized cost of hydrogen, and all these opportunities that might be there for Angola, it scores relatively well. But then if you look at the economic transition, where we talk about how dependent it is on fossil fuels, the Human Development Index, government effectiveness, it scores very low. So here you can see really an area of Angola where a lot of support is likely needed, because the readiness of Angola is relatively low in terms of economic transition. And this is something that you can then go through for other countries. For instance, in India, you see a very different setup where you have a more diversified economy compared to Angola, and higher human capital indices. And once you've then done this, we can then think about different measures that the world would have to, how different support mechanisms that we have to look at. Historically, it's interesting to note that official development assistance has been quite low for fossil fuel producers in the past, and it's been much lower, much higher for non-fossil fuel producers. So there's probably a shift that has to occur, and different finance measures, institutional and technical capacity measures.
Ask you to finish up.
Yeah, this is the last slide. So those will have to happen. So maybe I'll pause here. Thank you very much, Yacob, for reminding me, and I'll then pass it back to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. I didn't introduce you as well. Philip Trotter, Professor of Energy Systems and more at the University of Wuppertal in Germany, but also has a strong association through his work in the climate compatible growth. Thank you, Philip. Okay, well, I mean, we've heard some of the kind of the contours of the paper that's under review at the moment. I mean, the questions that come up, of course, are different pathways and different challenges await low and middle income fossil fuel producer countries. Each has its own challenges with different national circumstances. So I wanted to invite Jean-Paul, if you could react to this, on the whole question of the economic challenges that LMIC countries face. This is the fossil fuel producers in the context of a decarbonized world, but also if you could sort of navigate, if possible, the economic diversification question, taking into account energy security, access, and dependency on fossil fuels. Over to you, Jean-Paul. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yacob, and thank you so much for having me as part of this discussion so close to COP, which I think reinforces its relevance. And congratulations, Philip, I think, for a really fantastic presentation. So just perhaps I would frame my response through what I will call 3 transformations. So I think we, understandably, in the context of the UNFCCC process and the Conference of Parties, there is a big focus on the transition away from fossil fuels and sometimes what we term the just transition. I prefer to emphasize the importance of a transformation, an economic transformation, because I think in the African context, it does mean completely reviewing the underlying principles of the way our economies are organized. And I will briefly touch on those, what I call the 3 transitions. And you have that economic transformation, which is linked to sustainable industrialization. This is intimately linked as well with the energy transformation, which is based on having affordable access to energy, which is clean, and the financing transformation, which is having reliable and predictable access to financial resources, which currently are very much dependent on external resources and less capacity for internal mobilization. So briefly on these 3 transformations. Firstly, the economic transformation, which I will link to this idea of sustainable industrialization. And this is about moving from a model which is extractive to one which is based on sustainable value chains. Essentially, the legacy of colonialism in the vast majority of African countries is that at the point of independence, there were commercial agreements that were set up for certain resources. And in the large majority of cases, these colonial arrangements have continued. They may have changed slightly in form, but in the majority of cases, there is little value addition. And the transformation that needs to happen is to focus on developing these value chains within countries and within the African region. If we look at some of the opportunities, for example, around critical minerals, certainly this will not be focused in one country. It will depend on countries properly coordinating amongst themselves to be able to develop that capacity. And I think the same around the energy production aspect linked to industrialization. As we go towards more renewables, we need that capacity for some manufacturing to be taking place across the African continent. We need the research and development to be happening on the continent. And where there is a continuation of fossil fuels, we need to increase the value addition that is happening on the continent. So moving to that energy transformation, the biggest and most transformative action that any African government can take to accelerate sustainable development will be to achieve energy access. There is a very interesting Rockefeller study from about 6 or 7 years ago, which showed that if you connect every household to electricity, you boost incomes by 34%. There is very few ways in which you can have that level of poverty reduction at the household level than by providing energy access. Because even if it is, ideally it is accompanied by many other measures, but even if it is not, it will provide so many other outlets and opportunities for growth at the individual household level, which can then be linked to other economic diversification strategies around the agricultural sector, for example, and allowing more aspects in those elements. And the third and final transformation around financing. In my current role with the United Nations Secretary General's office, we are in the office, the advisory on Africa. So we do an annual report on the implementation of Agenda 2063 and on the NEPAD goals. And in the most recent report, we have seen that Africa loses in financial flows about 500 to 600 billion US dollars worth of flows per annum. It's very, very significant. Of course, this is a mix of various factors, which include illicit financial flows linked to corruption. But in many cases, and in the majority of cases, it is actually linked to commercial practices, and that essentially is transfer pricing. And if we were better able to tap into those resources, and that includes by having African financial institutions better able to invest within Africa, and that means addressing, for example, the risk premium or the associated risk premium of investing in Africa, that would be one of the most transformative actions. And this cannot happen overnight. There has to be support from development partners to allow that transformation to take place. But I think by linking a lot of the financing capacity to sovereign wealth funds, pension funds across the continent, we can increase the capacity for financing within the continent for these transformations. I'll stop there, Yacob, and happy to follow up with any further questions and exchanges.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jean-Paul. I mean, really interesting layout in terms of, the importance of underpinning sustainable industry, as a way to move away from this extractivist model of development, but also the centrality of energy access, certainly to support this as well. So let me now turn to Navroz Dubash. I mean, this question relates to, it's quite specific to India in terms of the challenges that India encounters in its effort to decarbonize and shift away from coal production and consumption. So how is India meeting these challenges? You only have 5 minutes, Navroz.
Well, thank you, Yacob, and thank you to the organizers. I'm really glad to be part of this panel. I'm going to make my job even harder by actually talking about things other than India also, all in 5 minutes. But I want to actually start, and so I sort of plan to say 4 things. Let me try and kind of rattle through them. The overarching point I want to make is that I think this paper and the effort of these authors represents it's a good indication of a growing recognition that when we're talking about low carbon futures, we're talking about low carbon development futures, in particular in the context of the developing world, and that these have to be viewed in context of different circumstances, in different geographies and based on different histories and so on and so forth. So the graph that, or the figure that Philip showed captured some of that nicely. Interestingly, it's one of the few figures where, you know, something is captured by area, and India is actually small. It's normally one of the 2 giant bubbles. So, but it's a good point, right? India doesn't actually depend. So fossil fuels as a share of the total economy is not a big story in India. And therefore, the paper says that in India, the situation is really about an energy transition and an energy just transition. And I think that's right. So I'll come back to that. But why does context matter so much, right? So in India, for example, renewable energy is growing. The government has sort of really decided to double down on capacity expansion. But at the same time, thinking about renewable energy as a share of electricity production, as opposed to simply capacity expansion, is much more challenging because of the lock-in in India, as in many countries, to a fossil fuel economy. But these are very, very country specific. So in India, what are some of those lock-ins? Well, it's very strongly tied to the banking sector. So a bunch of public sector banks have given loans to the coal sector. But also interestingly, coal freight in India cross-subsidizes passenger rail, which is politically a really important issue in a country with so many migrants, right? So you unravel, so if you start decreasing coal freight, you start making the railways unviable, right? So that's an example of the kind of very specific national political economies we're dealing with. I wanted to make a sort of a related point that kind of engages with something that Philip said. Of these 3 transitions, indeed, in India, the energy transition and the equitable fossil fuel transition are sort of are primary. But it's not like in India, the conversation around an economic transformation isn't also very real, right? Because India doesn't just want to shift to renewable energy. We want to be competitive in emergent renewable energy technologies, whether it's batteries, EVs, solar panel manufacturers, wind turbines, et cetera, et cetera. So even though it's a relatively small share of the economy, it's that small dot I was talking about, smaller dot as I was talking about, nonetheless, both for security reasons as well as for job creation reasons, India doesn't want to lose out as being, doesn't want to be just deploying, wants to also be part of the manufacturing and the technology development side of the sector. And I think that will be true in most countries. So I think keeping an eye on being part of clean energy value chains is going to be something that every country will be wanting to do. But of course, the ability to do that, particularly in today's context of increasing fragmentation of the global economy and the trade regime, is going to be tougher and tougher. So this is another, it's something the paper can't go into. It's just too much. But I think it's something for us to collectively keep our eye on. So those are actually my first 2 points, the context specificity and the links to economic transition. The third point, very briefly, is that in terms of the support required, clearly clean energy transitions are capital intensive, right? The upfront costs are high, costs of capital are considerable. And I'm not sure we have a very convincing story about why private capital will flow to the developing world. There's a little bit of sort of, you know, so one of the purported solutions is, well, we'll just de-risk, right? We'll use public money to de-risk, but it's not clear that that has worked or is working. The other story is, well, we have to change the regulatory and enabling environment in the developing world, which is a bit of a chicken and egg story, right? Because we've got all these locked in political economies. You change that environment. What if the money doesn't flow? So we need a lot more work on this. But the change in the regulatory environment story brings me to my fourth point, which is that even if we accept, and I think we're moving in this direction, that these are very context-specific transitions, even if we accept that there are political economies that have to be dealt with, the next question then becomes, how does each country develop its own pathway to actually figuring out what version of a low carbon development future makes sense in that context? Because we each know our own context best. And how do we figure out the transition pathways to get there? Which requires, an enormous amount of capacity. I would suggest it also requires a lot of more attention that we give to institutions. We don't have places in most of our governments that are thinking explicitly about this point, and not just in governments, but that are porous institutions that are open to civil society, business, civil society, in ways that we can figure this out in a collective way. So we're not asking those questions, nor do we have the capacity to answer them right now in most of our countries. And the sort of technical assistance part of it, some of this knowledge coming from overseas, I think most of us have some skepticism about whether that works, whether it builds the lasting capacity, whether it ends up being one size fits all, whether it engages adequately with the political economy, and so on. So so just very quickly then, 4 quick points. It's great that we're taking context seriously. We absolutely need to double down on that. The second is energy transformations increasingly need to be low carbon development transformations, and that invariably involves also thinking about economics and economic transformation and low carbon value chains. The third point is we don't have great answers on the money flows and how to deal with the capital needs. And the fourth is we need institutions at home to try and figure out these transition strategies in ways, and ideally in ways that build institutional memory and ownership over this transition in country contexts. Thanks, Yacob.
Navroz, that was beautiful. Thank you. I think, nicely organized layout, which actually links quite well with what I was going to ask Mohamed. I mean, we have an emerging situation where, on the one hand, there are producer countries, and this is specifically to Africa, and they face certain challenges or expectations, if you want to call it that, in their decarbonization or decarbonization pathways. And then there's also the emerging fossil fuel producers who are faced with this dilemma of do I or do I not? Where do we stand on this, Mohamed? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yacob, for the question, and for the previous co-panelists who really painted well the picture. I think, from the African Development Bank perspective, I mean, what has been interesting in the last 10 years, let's say from 2010 to 2020, just before the COVID, we've seen a tremendous increase in installation of renewable energy capacity on the continent. So really 77% increase in capacity. When you compare with fossil fuel, for energy production, for electricity production, for example, natural gas, it has increased at about 100%. But in terms of energy consumption, the renewable energy consumption has been, much more than the fossil fuel. And why? I mean, for example, for natural gas, it's mainly because it's been used for peaking power. Because one of the big issues that we're having in our countries, whether emerging fossil fuel producer or not, is really to be able to stabilize the grid, because the baseload power that is needed is usually not there or very expensive. And so it's quite interesting that also to note that, so there is, you have to maybe really unpack a little bit, how this transition is happening in these countries, because, you have the issue of energy access, which is, extremely important, and which off-grid renewable energy has been also, being provided, but largely by private operation, not by public. And that also has its challenges, because we're seeing more and more, private operators going in rural Africa, providing solar home systems and mini grids, but at rates that are not necessarily affordable, and that is linked to the cost of capital, that we're referring to. But also, when you're looking at the IPPs model, so you're looking at most of the electricity that has been produced from renewables has been given by independent power producer on the continent. So there's been a lot of focus on providing, frameworks to allow, independent power producers. But mainly, except for South Africa, maybe Egypt, most of it has been coming from companies that are outside of the continent. So again, when we're looking at where the capital is coming from and where the financial flows are going, there's clearly, a sort of a mismatch. And so, and in South Africa particularly, you have this ecosystem where financiers, private developer, project developer are local and understand the market. And that's why also there has been more rapid deployment there, because the capital was available. But when you're looking at countries like Mozambique, Senegal is a good example. It's an emerging, fossil fuel producer that currently has about 25% of its electricity mix that is variable renewable energy. It has no hydropower or geothermal, baseload potential. So it would have to rely today on using the natural gas that is emerging to actually switch some of the diesel station that is providing 80% of the baseload power. Please, sorry, just give me a second. So that is provided. That is providing about 80% of the baseload power for a transition towards bringing in more renewable into the context. So, I think it's quite as we mentioned, it has to be really context specific, because each country is crafting its own pathway. We are seeing it happen. Again, at the African Development Bank, we have had years where 100% of our approvals for energy electricity production project have been renewable energy based. And we're seeing more and more of these countries, like Mozambique, who's already largely a hydropower, base load is increasing its non-variable, renewable energy into the context. And they are really looking at beyond electricity production. We are now seeing an emerging, area on e-mobility on the continent. And interestingly enough, UNEP did quite an interesting sort of readiness index for e-mobility on the continent, which we participated in. And countries that seems to be ready for the transition are actually the one, using fossil fuels today. So the Egypt, the Angola, South Africa, etc. So it's quite interesting to see that just because you're either an emerging or you're currently using fossil fuel as part of your energy mix doesn't mean that you're not ready or you're not preparing for that transition. And how does transition have to look like? I mean, it has to, we all have to be able to provide this technical assistance and capacity to this country, because we are also very focusing on energy production, but we forget about the utilities themselves that are publicly owned and that are usually managing these grids, and that where you see, if you look at the financial flow, very little financing has gone to supporting the infrastructure side of things, whether it's on electricity or transport infrastructure. It needs to happen. There needs to be way more capital flowing towards them. And a last thing that I want to mention on the financing flows, when you're talking about off-grid, I mean, think about the African diaspora, brings in around, I believe, 100 billion every year, on the continent, which is about 3 to 5% of the continent GDP. That is already, really fragmented, but there should be ways to, really looking at how do we mobilize part of this financing to contribute to the energy access, mission, and also why not also investing in renewable energy power plants, because this diaspora is actually willing to contribute to the progress of the electrification of the continent, but no one is addressing really how they could mobilize their financing, which would definitely be at a cheaper rate that we are getting, from the capital market and other institutions. So I'll leave it there and probably provide some other pointers from what we are seeing in the sector and what we're doing to support the transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. I mean, that's a really nice tour in some of the real technical challenges, but also you're looking at us in thinking beyond capital markets and explore different opportunities for financing, which you included the diaspora, for instance, as one option. That's, thank you so much. But we'll come back to this given the time. So Tasneem, you have the final task of tying everything together, this really complicated discussion on questions around implications of the global level decarbonization, the implication it has on fossil fuel countries in LMIC, but taking maybe even the specific case of South Africa and and the role that you have as an activist. Where do we stand? How do we go? How do we facilitate just transition as we look at a different world? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yacob, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. And it's always difficult to be the last speaker in a panel, and especially a panel like this. But let me just say, I completely am in alignment with, well, all speakers, and especially the way Jean-Paul framed it for us. We talk about transitions and we sort of then disaggregate that into, we're going to have a just energy transition and we're going to have a, in different sectors, whereas what we're really talking about, and I will take it one step further because the science actually says it in a way that what we're really talking about is radical transformations of our economies, of society, and sectors within economies. So certainly I think when we have, and this really important work of how we phase out fossil fuels and especially fossil fuel production, I would want to argue that it cannot be divorced from the overall frame of the choices we make in the models, the economic models and paradigm or framework in which we decide to have that. And I would want to suggest that the kind of transformation aspect of this, which should be the overarching frame for transitions, has to take us away from the existing model, the economic models. We talk very much within existing economic models. We talk about, de-risking and capital intensive and all of that. And I think we have the opportunity and probably would absolutely have to challenge ourselves in stepping out and looking at alternative models for the economy and development particularly. And that's where I want to support Navroz. I think our starting point, and especially for low and lower middle income countries, but across the board in developing countries, our starting point has to be what development pathways and development plans we have for our countries. And so there is this national context that I'm happy, is being framed up. And so I'd add the second layer to that. You will not be able to only do national context specific planning in the kind of globalized world we live in. And if we're moving towards the interconnectedness, I think Navroz spoke about value chains, etc., you will have to have that regional and international dimension that layers over national context. I say that because an important part of achieving a just and equitable phase out has to happen at those levels. It has to happen within a national context. So justice and equity needs to be served at that level, but absolutely also a just and equitable the relationship between countries, and especially global north and global south. And so we have to see it in both those, the context-specific planning that's relevant and appropriate for a national context, but what's that international layer and framework and architecture that supports all of this? Because you're not going to be able to do a national context-specific planning without also understanding, quite frankly, what your carbon budget looks like. What, if all of us did bottom-up planning without a sense of what's that, the parameters in which this also happens, because this is climate related as well, then certainly that would be a challenge for all of us. So I want to argue the two things. One, massive rethink about our paradigms on economic development. And secondly, the layer that overarches all of this from a national context just and equitable approach to an international just. So who goes first, for example? You know, do we have our low middle income countries going first in the phase out? Would the pace of a phase out be determined by the levels of international support and cooperation it receives, etc.? So we have to interrogate that from that kind of national, international support perspective, especially as well. Now, let me refer quickly to the South African example. And I know Mohamed said, you know, it's going really well in South Africa. I don't have such a rosy picture as a South African. Right now, we're still experiencing load shedding, but I understand, you know, the IPPs, etc. The JETPs, and I'm sure many of you have been in different conversations about the JETPs. I think there's a lot of lessons that we can draw from how the JETPs have played out in South Africa itself. You know, so, and it's another, I want to use the example as a way of us challenging ourselves in terms of us working within existing frames. In South Africa, firstly, from the South African perspective, and here one of the things we have to add to all our dimensions and layers is the kind of unpredictability of politics. And if you don't have, you know, a lot of this is about politics and power, and if you don't have the political and governance structures that's aligned and certain, you know, the JETPs had a rocky start because we had internal political differences about the very fact that we should have JETP and what the JETP, is it bailing out our utility? Is the renewables our future? No, we have a future for coal, all of that. So politics plays a really important, and if it's unstable in terms of the direction of travel, then we have challenges. Then from the so-called partner side, the total lack of transparency around the financing itself, right? So, you know, big announcements. Then when the little details start emerging, we realize it's actually mainly loans-based financing, which literally, and for, if this is a model we want to use for low and middle income countries, that's awful, because essentially you're now putting those countries into a further debt trap and a debt burden. And it you know, loans-based financing, or the majority of it being loans-based, is going to be deeply challenging for low and middle income countries. And a very small portion of South Africa's JETP financing is grants-based. I think it's 2% or less than 2%. And when you talk about those different dimensions of dependency, one of those I saw in the paper deals with social protection, for example. And when you're phasing out, if you're highly dependent on fossil fuels and you're phasing out, and I think one of the panelists spoke about workers and the implications for workers, never mind workers, what about those communities that also are impacted communities, dependent on the value chains and supply chains in fossil fuel production? They need social protection, because there's not going to be an automatic absorption into other sectors if you're not getting your economic diversification plans right. The renewable energy sector is not going to absorb all fossil fuel workers, as an example. So social protection measures will be required, but you're not going to get social protective measures based on loans coming from the global north. So I think there's a number of things that we have to learn from, and it's not just JETPs that we learn from, it's past development, you know, practices, and then our deeper challenge of, is this an opportunity to actually get a new economic order in the world? Okay, I'm just saying it like that, you know, with all of its challenges.
All right.
A new economic order, and then do the transitions.
Thank you, Tasneem. New economic order. There used to be a new international economic order in the 70s, wasn't there? No, but thank you so much. And absolutely, I mean, radical transformations, but also, you know, not to forget the international dimension, but the politics also is, you know, inherently there. It's ever present, and it's understanding that, and how do you navigate and not to forget that in the end, there is such a thing called society. Yeah. So thank you, Tasneem. There are a few questions that have come up, and we don't have a lot of time. What I will do is I'll just pitch some of these questions, but also ask you, to say something about the supportive measures that the international community can offer, or the international system. What does it need to do? In what way does it even need to reform itself to provide that sort of support? If you could pick this up, but also, just one other thing which came up in the question was the role of high-income countries. Why are they, the way in which they are pushing, natural gas? Is this a contradiction in the way that that they have been framing their agenda, but at the same time others having to fall to a different type of way? Both the national and the external looking face of high-income countries, it seems to be in contradiction of some kind. So I'll ask you to pick. So it'll be 1 minute for each of you, but please concentrate also on the international. Let me kick off with Navroz.
Thanks, Yacob. Okay, so not much breathing space there from those questions. So let me just make two quick points. I think that let me focus on the gas story. I think that we really are in a situation where the kinds of reports, at least those of us outside Africa, are reading of European nations trying to nail down gas contracts on the back of sort of perceived energy insecurity post Russia-Ukraine. These kinds of stories really sort of raise a serious credibility question, right? If we are in fact looking at having to keep it in the ground and only a finite amount of fossil fuel to burn, then for countries that are really have needs met and then much more in the name of security, to be talking about trying to sort of nail down gas contracts, and I think John Paul made this point, right? Energy access is the absolute sort of basic essential need to starting. That's where it should be used. So I'm stumbling here, but let me just end with the summary point I'm groping towards, which is that if we're going to have scarce fossil fuel that we can burn and stay within a carbon budget, then perhaps an interesting principle might be that it should be used where it has the greatest welfare gains. And that is in the developing world, where you're starting at the lowest levels for basic energy access. If we could agree with a principle like that, that would make a lot of sense.
Thank you, Navroz. Thank you. And also great to keep it within the time. Mohamed?
Yeah, thanks. I think I will just piggyback on what Navroz has mentioned and just, not focused only on energy access, but when you take the natural gas, for example, value chain, I mean, the African continent is, by and large, an agriculture, economy, for smallholder farmers and all. And natural gas provide also, with all the phosphate and byproducts that it can provide to boost agricultural production, or, for smallholder farmers, but also for, also the transition towards, larger, farming. So I do think that what is important is to focus on, the value chains and understanding that it has to come first from, the energy transition, or that transition that, the countries want to embark on has to come from them. And I think there was someone mentioned about the fact that there is a need to have this kind of forums where you have, everybody represented to really understand where the country is trying to go, and also looking at a regional approach, because we are, for example, in ECOWAS, there's a regional block where we see interdependencies between countries. Landlocked countries are very relying on coastal countries for many things, including electricity transfer, energy, fossil fuel. So there is this, kind of support that needs to be done at national level and at regional level to decide, together, where they're trying to go in terms of the energy transition, what is the priority, and this is where international institution can come in to support that already base that they would provide, as this is where we're trying to go. I think that would be the best way to to support the just energy transition, but it has to come from within first before any international support comes in. That's how I frame it. Thanks.
Thanks, Mohamed. Thank you very much. And of course, I mean, Philip, you're also part of this final panel. Can I invite you?
Sure, thank you, Yacob. Just very quickly, maybe on this, I think this point on supply chains has been made again and again, and I think it's a very, very critical one. And of course, also this push to look at international partners. One thing that I've been thinking about recently, lately, is kind of I feel like even in these global supply chains and in this global transformation that we're seeing, or the transition, is that mainly the global south often is still kind of a taker of what the global north puts on the table. So you have these issues where, for instance, in Germany now we have a supply chain law that mandates certain, human rights code of conduct. We have the carbon border adjustment mechanisms in the European Union that puts a price on carbon. There are all these kind of different things that I think where the global north is trying to transition towards sustainable outcomes, which is great, but it kind of forgets the dynamics that occur then in global south countries who don't really sit at the table but are kind of takers of these policies, and then global supply chains and opportunities and challenges kind of shift with these policies that are being kind of thought up and cooked up in the global north. So I think if we're really talking about this this shift that Tasneem was talking about, I think we need to if we want to build sustainable supply chains that can work for everyone, I think some of these decisions we have to look much more eye to eye and see which kind of policy implications or policy impacts that we have in the global north then also are there for the global south, and how can we actually transition towards that. And I think we need to think a lot broader in those spheres. Thank you.
Many thanks, Philip. Many thanks. Thank you for that. You've mentioned Tasneem, so I'll go to Tasneem then so she can connect with what you are saying. Thank you.
Thanks. So I want to support Navroz, actually. We have a remaining carbon space. My goodness, it's limited. And I'm sure you would have seen Oxfam's recent report about climate inequality, which talks about the 1%. So for me, what does international support look like? And so moving beyond the kind of finance support piece, the one thing for sure that global north countries should do is just phase out, like pretty soon. Two things, actually. One, no new production. And yet we're seeing they're issuing licenses left, right, and center. So essentially, you locking in all of that, future emissions. It's sucking away the remaining carbon space, and developing countries, again, will not have space for development. So the first thing in terms of international support, rich nations must stop. No new production, and secondly, phase out faster than any other developing countries. And there's ways of measuring. We're doing some work as civil society on extractives equity. And if you are all at the COP, we'll be launching that report at the COP, and we could see how these two pieces of work actually align and talk to each other. That would be a great dialogue. So Yacob, for me, international support over and above the finance story is actually for developing countries' interests, for their development. Stop sucking the carbon space dry. Stop with your emission, your licensing and fossil production. On gas, I think Mohamed's answered the question. I think it's really perverse to consider natural gas as a renewable or clean energy source. I think the limitations of maybe in transition planning, in national context, as they're calling it a transition fuel, countries need to identify what that actually means in terms of their energy pathways. How long would they need to rely on natural gas to transition to completely clean? and just not have it for export purposes, but for domestic purposes. You know, the only reason there's an increase in natural gas, it's the demand from the north, this whole scramble for gas, not just in Africa, but in Asia now. So certainly, I would think natural gas role limited to transitions. Countries must determine the timeframes for that, and it's definitely not for supplying the demands of the global north.
Wow, brilliant. Tasneem, we'll be seeing you in at the COP for sure. Thank you. Over to you, Jean-Paul.
No, thank you so much, Yacob, and really, I think all the comments have been fantastic and really reinforce, I think, what we want to do. I'll focus on, I think that we are in a scenario where everything needs to happen all at once. Unfortunately, there's no sequencing possible. We have to be doing everything simultaneously, and that's just the reality of the urgency that we face, both in terms of achieving development and decarbonization. I think but maybe looking at it first at the level of countries and of the African region, of the African continent, there does have to be a clearer narrative on the path that African countries want to pursue. Because I think there is still, we've talked about just energy transition plans, for example. I think really countries need to define very clearly where they see their pathways. In many cases, countries will need support for this because not all have highly developed universities or researchers that are able to provide that support. And I think that there has to be that capacity built up, but there has to be that definition and linking that precisely to the point about economic transformation. Just talking about a transition makes no sense unless you are linking it to how you want your economy to evolve. Now, where do the international partners come in? There needs to be a very clear and reliable and predictable source of financing, which today is not there. Today, even if you have your fantastic JETP, you are still very much uncertain about where this financing comes, and it's very nebulous. So there has to be that certainty, and I think there's a variety of tools that must be used. There has to be a large scale increase in the amount of grant financing that deals with a lot of these access issues, or at least provides the seed financing for access issues. Because in many countries, the access is being hindered because if you go purely on commercial terms, while these people are potential future consumers, their immediate capacity to pay is limited. But the point is that if they do eventually connect, the impact will be absolutely transformative. That also includes de-risking for the private sector, because a large amount of financing has to come from the private sector. By the way, it's just a reality that no country has done this without that happening side by side. Where I think there is a huge opportunity is that this has been done before between relatively underdeveloped regions and more developed regions. We've seen it in the project of the European Union, for example, when as new countries came in, there was dramatic flows of resources from the more developed regions into the regions that are trying to catch up, and on very concessional terms, and very critically linked to the transformation and reform of an improvement of efficiency of the energy sectors in those regions. So I'll stop there and just say that I think that if we're looking at global growth, if we really want to save the world, it has to start in Africa, because that's where you're going to have the demographic dividend. It's where all the minerals that are necessary for the transition are going to come from, and it's therefore where we need to focus the transformation on happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Thank you to all of you. Jean-Paul, Tasneem, Mohamed, Navroz, and of course Philip, for a wonderful session. This is not a session that should be restricted to 1 hour. We could sit and spend the whole day. So it's a very tough and highly complex and involved issue with so many elements to it and different entry points for solutions as well. So I think it's been a remarkable discussion, and we hope to continue this at the COP for those of you who will be there. A big thank you to everyone else who attended as well.